Zinga A Fraser is an assistant professor of African Studies and Gender Studies at Brooklyn College. She joins us now from New York live. Thanks so much for being with us. You know, there's really been, or at least there have been so many complaints of a void in national leadership since, over the course of the past week and since these protests really started, since George Floyd was killed. First, what do you think? And would you have wanted to see the President of the United States, for example, step up and really try to take the lead at a time like this?
I think the president has shown and his administration has shown how they feel about specifically Black and brown people, but also people who are poor, people who are migrants. So if for any reason, if the administration or President Trump provided to have some solace, to have some compassion, to have some empathy for the loss of Black life, it would be mute for a number of demonstrators and protesters who are taking to the streets to address their discomfort, their rage, their anger, their sadness, and their grief over the current administration's regards to them.
Zinga, we knew when he was running for president, and even prior, that he wasn't necessarily the most racially sensitive person. Some say he certainly has a lack of empathy, to put it mildly. So it's also, in a sense, a reflection of how other Americans do feel. They seem to think that is excusable. My question is then, where do the real solutions lie? Can racism in America somehow be reined in? Are there ways to address the problem, or is it so ingrained that it almost, at this point, seems to many impossible to fix?
Well, it's ingrained. It's ingrained since African Americans and indigenous people were how they were treated in this country. And so it really requires substantial institutional and structural change. And so the issues around kind of Black Lives Matters and the issues that we're seeing, not only about kind of state violence, but we're in a global pandemic where African Americans specifically in the United States, in Brooklyn, New York specifically, where I am located, are more likely to had the infection rate of COVID, right? So we're in a global pandemic and we're still addressing, it's not only addressing the state violence, the police brutality, the over-policing, the use of military forces for Black and brown people, but also addressing the institutional inequalities around education, around housing. All of these things are representative of what people are going through. And so it really requires a leadership to address these issues, to speak to the needs of those people. People are out of jobs. Young students who are on the streets are no longer in school because of COVID. So there has to be a systemic way of the ways in which we think about addressing race and racism, institutional racism, capitalism, and the ways in which globalism operates for marginalized people.
Right. But if you think of ways to change that at the institutional level, the United States tried, and still to some extent is trying, affirmative action programs, for example. Now, those were fought at the level of the Supreme Court, and some, especially when it comes to education in the U.S., were knocked down. They were suppressed. Do you think that was part of the solution that was actually taken out of the equation unfairly, and America still needs to see that kind of action taken under the law to re-enfranchise minorities in the country?
I mean, so there are a number of different kind of public policies to address, right? So affirmative action is one, but if you think about those who benefited the most for affirmative action were actually white women. Right. And so when we think about the ways in which we address these inequalities, specifically in education, we've had a number of political candidates that say that, education actually should be free. We should fund institutions like the ones that I work at Brooklyn College. You should fund public institutions so that students are not enamored with this public debt, right? Students are graduating, or in order to get an education, they have to go in an enormous debt. And then they get out of school, and then there are no jobs for them, right? And so there are ways that we can make significant economic and institutional change, but it requires a reckoning, right? It requires a reckoning to address the issues of white supremacy, the way it is pervasive in every part of American life. And the ways in which we do that requires us to have broad sweep changes. And we have to have an administration as well as a public outcry and understanding of those issues.
Okay. Zinga, quickly, I mean, you talk about a public outcry. So what about the protests underway right now? Do you think the right voices are being heard? Some say they're being hijacked by Antifa or anarchists that have, brought in this level of violence that have ruined a very important cause and the voices that needed to be listened to.
I think that we do need to focus on established and unestablished organizations that continue to work around these issues. What I have seen over the weeks is that you don't necessarily see some of the people who were involved initially in organizing and those kind of elected officials, as well as other organizations who focus on police brutality, economic, social, and political change. And I think those are the voices that we need to focus on. It is apparent that some of the press in the United States, they're not necessarily asking those people, right? And so you have a kind of disjointed public media perception around what these uprising and rebellions look like and why they're happening.
Okay, Zinga Fraser, we will leave it there. Thank you really so much for joining us. We appreciate it.